Okay, Harry, I think we're all ready whenever you are.
Thank you, Chloe. We're now recording. Welcome to this special meeting of the January 11th, 2021 meeting of the City of Charleston Planning Commission. As I said, this is a special meeting of the Planning Commission, and our agenda today revolves around our comp plan renewal, the Charleston City Plan. We've got a number of reports from our consultant teams, 3 of them that have been working, and we'll have a public comment section. And with that, I believe that I will turn it over to Christopher Morgan. Christopher.
Thanks, Harry. So we've got a ton of information for you all today. This is going to be major information overload. I hope it will be in a digestible form. I think it will be, but this is going to be probably more info than you all have seen in any of our other special meetings on the comprehensive plan. But we are in the thick of it right now. We are literally writing the plan every day and gathering other information. And you will see a lot of what we're basing the plan draft on in today's discussion. And we're eager for you all to see this. And I hope you all feel very free to ask lots of questions. Now is the time to let us know if there are things in this that are concerning to you, that you want more info on, or you're not understanding or something like that, because we're basing all of our plan on the types of information you're going to be seeing today. So I hope you will give it lots of attention, and so much appreciate you all taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in today. And I think with that, Chloe, are you going to start off on the engagement and introduce our consultants on that one?
Yes. So I'm going to be tag teaming with our engagement team to give the Planning Commission an overview of everything that we did in the first round of engagement and what we heard from folks during those efforts. But first, for all of the engagement team that's here on the call, if you want to unmute yourself and share your video and just introduce yourself before we get started.
Hello, everyone. My name is Thatika Robinson. I'm with the SECO Group.
Hello, everyone. My name is AJ Davis. I'm with Community Solutions Consulting.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Jackson, Community Solutions Consulting.
Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Hussey, and I'm with Civic Communications.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And I'm Chloe Super for everyone else on the call, and have been working very closely with our engagement team. In our first round, we engaged over 3,000 residents that participated in some way, shape, or form. Over 300 participated in city-led virtual gatherings. We had 21 of those. We had 5 open listening sessions, so it's not geographically based. One of those was held all in Spanish with simultaneous interpretation for the English speakers. We had 10 area-specific listening sessions, so 2 for each main area of the city. We had 4 housing labs and 2 water labs. The housing labs were structured like listening sessions, whereas the water labs were information, primarily for information sharing about our water and land use analysis. Had over 280 participants in community-led sessions. So we had a, excuse me one second. We had 11 different groups and organizations host their own gatherings, whether virtual, in person, and over 280 people participated in those. And then we had over 2,500 responses to an online survey, and also, it was also distributed for people to mail in. We used a variety of outreach strategies, including City of Charleston social media. We have a City Plan website that also has Spanish language available on it. We have a City Plan newsletter, a blog, We worked with our business and neighborhood services to get out information on the Hey Neighbor newsletter, no contact street canvassing, primarily by AJ and Eric getting out there to spread the word via postcards and flyers. And then we also partnered with Charleston Aquí Estamos and Community Solutions Consulting for their using their Facebook platforms to help get out the word as well. And of course, press releases. My apologies, my dog has chosen this time to get out his spooky toys. So I've had to confiscate them. Okay. So I'm going to try and move through these really quickly. We had about 30 questions on the survey, and it was a lot of really great information. I'm only going to go over the quantitative results today, not the qualitative one, because I haven't had a chance to comb through all of it yet. But also, it's just too much information to cover in the limited time we have. And I also want to leave time for our engagement team to go through the takeaways from the listening sessions. So a little bit about who participated. Only a quarter work in the city of Charleston, 32% of those on the peninsula. The second highest was West Ashley and North Charleston following that. 14% said not applicable, so presumably unemployed or retired. We got a lot of respondents from outside of the city of Charleston who are living in the region, but not within city limits. And a fair amount, 30 responses, it was a small percentage number, but 30 responses from folks who live in the city of Charleston but do not own a home or rent a residence. Got a good mixture across tenure in terms of how long people have been a community member of Charleston. My dog is being so loud right now. I really apologize. We had 5% of respondents are Spanish speakers, 4% speak other languages, and then we had 10 respondents identified as genderqueer and non-binary. Our survey, though strong in numbers, was not fully representative of the population city of Charleston. So I've flagged here where we got an overrepresentation in results and underrepresentation, and then throughout the survey results, I have highlighted some key differences among results for the categories that are underrepresented, so that we're getting a fuller picture of what it maybe some changes we may have seen had we gotten a more representative sample. So we were overrepresented among white respondents, folks who live in the lower part of the peninsula and ages 35 and above. We had underrepresentation from tenants, lower income folks, and I've specified here what I mean by that. And in terms of annual income, Black African American respondents, folks who live in the Upper Peninsula, James Island, and then youth, so age 24 and younger. So we asked questions related to transportation, mobility, housing, flooding challenges. The way that I've structured these results, I'm first going to start with how questions that we asked that help us define existing conditions, what people are experiencing now, and then I've grouped together the questions that look forward and to recommendations and for the plan. So starting with flooding, 20% responded that their home or property has been damaged by flooding in the past. This was higher for youth, tenants, and lower income respondents. 78% are concerned, either somewhat or very concerned about being impacted by flooding in the future. And it was a pretty even split between those who haven't and have taken actions to protect their home or property from flood damage. The percentage of folks who have taken actions was lower among youth and tenants. And I did want to note that it was for those who said not applicable. So presumably they don't have control over actions to protect their home or property. That amount was double. That percentage was double for Black and African American respondents, lower income respondents, youth, and tenants. For housing and mobility, 41% are somewhat or very concerned about being able to stay in their current housing. This was higher for Black and African American respondents, Upper Peninsula respondents, and much higher for lower income respondents, youth, and tenants. 87% use personal cars, primary mode of transportation, followed by walking and then biking. These alternative modes of transportation, there were more than just walking and biking. That more tenants and lower income respondents chose alternative modes of transportation as their primary mode. And I thought it was interesting, 4% of Black African-American respondents use rideshare service. This is a much higher percentage than overall, and then 3.4% of use carpool as their primary mode. Yes.
The first stat up there, the 41% that said they're concerned, is that just a general concern, or is that an economic related concern? Is it flooding, or just?
Great question. There's a follow-up question to that, which is an open-ended response, which is explaining what their concern is or lack thereof. And so we have that information and just have not compiled it yet. But it was, from what I remember just skimming over it, it was a mixture of economic and flooding related. For employment and the economy, we had a question about what, a list of options for people to select from, what makes it difficult for them to obtain a job in their preferred field or to be able to advance in their current field. So the highest ones, understandably, are acceptable pay rate, limited job openings, followed by affordable office and or commercial space. I'm not going to read through all of these, but what was more interesting to me was that when I broke it down to the underrepresented categories for Black and African American respondents, they had double the percentages for citing access to loans, whether it be business or educational loans, as being a primary, as being a hurdle. And then for youth and lower income respondents, again, double the percentage when it came to lack of access to reliable transportation. And then we did ask at the end of the survey, just how folks have been impacted by COVID. Majority chose, selected lost income or changed work location or commute, followed by children's education being negatively impacted. For Black and African American respondents, lower income respondents, youth and tenants, the percentage was 3 to 5 times higher across those groups for reporting losing housing or being at risk of losing housing. And then it was roughly double the percentage reporting losing a job for lower income respondents, youth, and tenants. So now looking forward, starting with the first question, which I apologize to everyone who took the survey. I heard a lot of feedback that they didn't like it because they didn't want to have to choose. This is a ranking question. We forced people to rank these. And so one takeaway from this is that I hope that no one reads this as the items on the bottom of the list not being important to quality of life. I think all of these we can agree are important to quality of life. And there was an other option, so there's more ideas. But these 5 here that I have highlighted, bolded in orange, when I broke it down, looked through each of the underrepresented categories, these 5 here that are bolded were consistently in the top 5 for each of those groups. Whereas when you look at it overall, it's a different top 5. So I did want to pull out that difference here. For flooding, we shared a list of recommendations that came out of the Dutch Dialogue study for how the city can decrease impacts of flooding and better manage water, and asked which folks would support. And it was a check as many as apply, so that this was not a ranking. So you can see here where we're seeing more support for improve and maintain drainage infrastructure, and with the least support for prioritizing areas of the city at higher elevation for higher density development. This was consistent with all underrepresented categories, so there wasn't really any notable differences there. for the sake of time, I'm not going to read through each of these, but I'm going to pause to let y'all look at these before we move on. We also listed a list, or provided a list of housing strategies that other cities have used, that have come out of some of the reports that the city has worked on, and saw the most support for mixed income development and the least for allowing duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. There was a difference among the underrepresented categories. There was generally more support for all of these tools from Black and African American respondents, lower income respondents, youth, tenants, and Upper Peninsula residents, with one interesting difference for the strategy of encouraging smaller private yards and more shared community open space. Black and African American respondents, there was only 38% versus what you see here being 50% of Black and African American respondents were in support of that strategy. Okay, so this was, which of the following does your neighborhood lack that you wish you had nearby? So again, all of these things are great things to have nearby, but thinking about what's maybe lacking. And one thing that we'll do when we're putting together land use recommendations for each area of the city is we'll break this down by zip code for each area of the city so we can see those differences, but this is just citywide. And so some notable differences from the underrepresented categories. Black and African American respondents selected employment options and offices more often. Lower income respondents selected employment options, offices, trade workshops, parks, community centers, and cultural institutions more often. Tenants selected employment options, offices, trade workshops, grocery stores, cultural institutions more often. And then youth selected employment options, parks, community centers, grocery stores, and cultural institutions. And then we asked a question about if respondents would like to see more land and water access preserved for recreational public use, and 86% said yes. And finally, with mobility, 76 responded that they would walk, 76% that they would walk or bike to places they go often if they had a safe and convenient way to do so. And among all underrepresented groups, with the exception of Black and African American respondents, a higher percentage than 76% answered yes. 46 responded that they would use a water taxi daily, weekly, or monthly if it were offered as a public transportation option. So less than half. But then when you looked across the underrepresented categories, that flipped, and it was consistently over half for all of those underrepresented categories that would use it daily, weekly, or monthly. Youth were there was the highest percentage of youth that responded daily, 3 times higher than the overall. Right, that is the survey results, quick as that I could get through. Do y'all have any questions before we move on to listening sessions? Great. All right, I will pass it to, who am I passing it to? Fatiga or AJ?
AJ.
AJ. All right. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Housing Lab. We staff-led Housing Lab listening sessions, 4 of them overall, just to get a little bit more into the conversation of affordability, gentrification, and displacement, and defining what the housing challenge is and what some recommendations might be. So here are some of the takeaways from how the housing challenges have been defined. So gentrification and displacement being a loss of physical and cultural sense of place, that a lot of the challenges and the cost of home maintenance, especially for elderly residents, that there's high eviction rates. So it's not just, housing creation, but keeping folks in housing, but there are housing barriers beyond cost and not just looking at affordability. When people can't afford to move, they often get stuck in substandard housing. Absentee landlords are an issue. Neighborhoods, when gentrification also looks like neighborhoods becoming consumer destinations, it's not always just who is now living there and who's not. With the rising property taxes, rising land values, it increases the profit motive and also affects affordability. But and there's concerns about this getting worse with sea level rise, and with that and flooding, flood insurance costs are a real problem, and flood damage, being able to repair after flood damage. And then for recommendations, housing for all income levels, including folks who make no income, all life stages, all household sizes, allowing for a mixture of housing types and neighborhoods, looking to Wagner Terrace and Old Windermere as great examples of that, building up and in, not out, so avoiding sprawl, allowing smaller homes and smaller lots, encouraging sustainability and creativity, prioritizing investing in longtime Black residents and business owners, looking into the impact of Board of Architectural Review standards. So there was an agreement on what the impact is. So recommendation to look into that. Provide support and education to tenants. Collaborate regionally. It's a regional problem, so it needs regional solutions. Housing costs won't address the problem alone. You need to also look into wages, food insecurity, health insurance, and homelessness needs to be more of a focus in this conversation, not just affordable housing creation. So sorry about that. Now I'm going to pass it to AJ.
Chloe, before you pass that, on that,
yes,
on that recommendations, were those y'all's recommendations based on what you heard, or are those what the public recommended? Because those seem in conflict with some things that the survey said. You know.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Donna. And I should have prefaced the slides with that. So for this and the slides coming after this, this is relaying what we heard from folks in the listening session. So this is not staff recommendations. This is not, these are recommendations that people made that came out of the listening session. So directly from residents. The inconsistency that you are pointing out is probably due to the group of people who participated in these may represent a different demographic than the overall participation in the survey.
Well, and I also think it's an education problem because people think about, for example, mix of housing types. You know, they don't realize that there are very productive neighborhoods that have these right now, and they just see them as all single family residential until they get in there. And so we have a kind of a black-white issue, if you will, that's like either a single family residential neighborhood or a high-rise apartment complex. And when they're asked a question like this, they pick the either or and not realize the middle, which is, I've been so, you know, educated on missing middle, and people don't realize that really does exist in some neighborhoods right now. So I think part of the answers are an education process too. So I want to be careful as we interpret them, you know. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Donna. Okay, now I'm passing it to AJ. I apologize for that earlier.
All right, well, thank you, Chloe. Welcome and hello, Happy New Year to everyone for the meeting. Hope everyone had a great and safe holiday. Our team, along with the planning department, have been compiling and winding down the phase 1 engagement session for the city plan. So what you see on this slide are some of the overall themes that we gleaned from the notes that we all transcribed and siphoned through. First, we saw that overall, a lot of people wanted a multimodal transit improvement to make sure there's modes of transportation for everyone's lifestyle. Everyone does not have a car. Some people are relegated to using public transportation. Some people, as Chloe shared in one of the previous slides, use rideshare. So they want to have multimodal transit improvements that can accommodate all of those things. Of course, the usual suspect of flooding and drainage was a theme we heard throughout. No matter what part of the city that we were in, overall, people recognize that flooding causes tremendous impacts, especially as it relates to traffic and transportation. Another overall theme we heard was that we need more pedestrian access to walkable roads to get around in communities. I think we heard that significantly in areas like Johns Island and West Ashley as well, But overall, that was something that was in a lot of the notes that we compiled. Also, there was an idea of developing an equitable quality of life for all. I think, as Chloe referenced in the previous slide, a lot of people enjoy living here in Charleston. However, they feel as though as the city grows, sometimes the ability for everybody to enjoy all of the benefits of Charleston is not made available to everyone. And then there was the theme of cultural preservation. We are in a historic city, and as such, people want to maintain that image, that identity, while they also recognize that growth and development also somewhat changes that landscape. But they do want an effort to be put forth to maintain what made Charleston home for them. Next slide. All right, so the themes that we got from the listening sessions by area, and this is by no stretch of the imagination, everything, but in transcribing the notes, we wanted to make sure that we saw things that were uniform throughout and wasn't repetitive and were not repetitive. So please understand that this is just a small gleaning, but these were some of the most significant things that we saw and we read when we transcribed the notes. So on the peninsula, transportation, equitable building codes and processes for small businesses. A lot of times we think about housing, but we also saw that a lot of the conversation around the business community was very significant. Eliminating gentrification with cultural preservation and cost of living affordability. Again, we see a lot of the new buildings and whatnot being built. And I think folks were saying that they wanted to also maintain some of the aesthetic that currently exists within the peninsula. For James Island, we saw that flooding again was a concern amongst others for the historic African-American communities out on the island. Transportation infrastructure, safety, pedestrian and bike rider accessibility. They also spoke about inconsistencies in coordinating between the town, city, and county regarding public services. They expressed concern regarding the scale and location of development. They felt that it was too large and too fast. Johns Island, they wanted preservation of the existing identity, rural agricultural of the island and its communities. They do not want to become downtown Charleston 2.0. They desire mixed-use home development, not just single family, and adamant about the preservation of the indigenous African-American populations. Next slide. And West Ashley. West Ashley, we saw an appreciation of the connectivity, although there are still areas of improvement. They would like to see increased marketing of the area to businesses for economic development, improved economic development, and also increase diverse housing options for the area, which kind of speaks to what I think Ms. Donna was talking about. It may be an educational option. For the Cane Hoy Peninsula, Wando area, and Daniel Island, we had the preservation of the Jack Primus community, all along with local green spaces, protect the longleaf pine forest. They also expressed the desire to have better neighborhood connectivity, access to waterways, improving transportation utilizing waterway access with a proposed ferry system. And they put specific emphasis on the preservation of the historic nature of the area. At this particular time, I'm going to transfer over to my colleague, Tatika Robinson, and she will take you through the next round of slides.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, AJ. So one of the things that we were very adamant about is making sure that when we think of diversity, we don't automatically think of African Americans or those of African descent. So we live in a very diverse city, and oftentimes we might have our blinders on, but there are other communities outside of that, of white and Black, that do live with amongst us. Of that is the Hispanic and Latinx community. And so we partnered, we specifically held this particular session to make sure that they felt comfortable to be in the same space with each other versus being in the midst of others where they'd have troubles with translation or with understanding. So we were able to do this with Art Pot, and so which is a Hispanic nonprofit organization that focuses on serving the Latinx and Hispanic community, specifically grassroots as well. This was a great partnership, and this was very big for the city for this year. So what we did hear from them specifically was something that's, it's not a surprise. They are just like all of us. They want a sense of community and they want to feel connected to the city. In the midst of that, however, they do have language justice, and quality of life is a big area for them. When we focus on inclusion and understanding, not all of the Hispanic community speaks the same language, and they often have concerns about their documentation. So they might not be as visual as attending things, because they're concerned of what may happen if they go to that, versus a sense of welcoming. Because we're speaking of the Charleston area, majority of Hispanic community and Latinx live in the Johns Island area. So the rural community and centrality to benefits of life really are important to them, and that's provided in that space. However, in that, the quality of streets, the lack of lighting, and the poor signage are problem areas in which they need to be able to know where they're going and how to get there. They also desire a place when it comes to outside with parks and recreation, a space that more highlights them to be able to commune with their families and youth. The specific ideas are soccer fields. That's not a surprise to many. That is very huge in their culture, as well as baseball fields, libraries, and places for work. They are also looking at bike lanes, and sidewalks would be helpful on the main streets, especially to connect neighborhoods, and at the high school as well. Personally, a quote that was taken is that, gentrification hurts. It feels awful when you're trying to fight to keep this harmony and unity within your culture and your community, only to see yourselves being pushed out. So they want to feel important. It's important to them to feel connected to their community, especially when you have language barriers. They also feel like the city should invest and welcome the Hispanic and Latinx community, because they feel that they want to feel like this is their home, and they want to feel connected, and they want to feel welcomed in this space, especially as they continue to root themselves here and their children begin to grow. As we moved into the community-led sessions, this was an opportunity for other organizations within the community outside the city to host meetings. Again, this would be just like the Hispanic Latinx community, which was an affinity group because it was only focused on there. These were affinity groups that could be organizations that serve the African-American community or specific areas of focus within the community. So those organizations are here as listed: the American Institute of Architects, the SECO Group, Center for Heirs Property, Charleston Area Justice Ministry, Charleston Climate Coalition, Coastal Conservation League, Community Solutions Consulting, Enough Pie, Low Country Black Parents Association, Low Country Local First, and Preservation Society of Charleston. All of these areas focus on, obviously, the architects and structure, heirs property when it pertains to African Americans and heirs property and how that's connected. You all should know that Charleston Area Justice Ministry is a connection of various congregations within the city of Charleston that they were covering, that they brought together to make sure that voice was heard. Obviously, climate, we know about Conservation League, and the Low Country Black Parent Association and Community Solutions Consulting partnered together to specifically host affinity groups focused on the African American and Black community. And Low Country Local First is about small businesses and obviously focusing on local connection and local buying. And then we have the Preservation Society. Of all of these groups, which were 11 that came together, they held a combination of virtual and socially distanced sessions that totaled 283 people that they reached. The themes of the community-led sessions were focused on the need for more diversity with community engagement for African-American, Latinx, and Hispanic communities, the lack of literacy about the city and its offerings, meaning that there may be an assumption that people know, that residents and community members know what's happening within the city, but that is not the same. They don't always know what's happening or what the offerings are. And so that disconnect impacts the way people live and engage from a historical context here in the Charleston area. Multimodal transportation options are needed. Safe bus stops and bus routes should support people who actually use the service every day. Outside of MUSC, for example, we have multiple bus stops, but they're not always in a safe location, or some of them are covered and some are not. And then also the actual bus routes, there was a concern of how long it takes for the buses to come back through. So often people are waiting up to an hour to 2 hours, or having to space that in between. And when you're trying to come for a shift or trying to get someplace, that's an issue. So their desire is to have multiple options for transportation so people can get around very quickly and effectively in the community. Affordable housing that will support working class. They feel like there's a disconnect between developers being accountable for, if they're going to build a hotel or other buildings, there should also be an accountability to match that with housing, because majority of the people who are working there are the working class. And so if we're going to build these buildings, let's keep in mind that the same individuals need to have access to their work in their home without having the issues of transportation. When it comes to small businesses, they are impacted due to flooding. A lot of times they have to shut down and they have to reap that deficit that they lose due to the flooding in the area. They really feel like we should hold developers accountable I'm sorry, I went up too high. They feel like there should be some options for free parking for their employees, as well as no meters after business hours, and also, again, providing diverse transportation options. There's also encourage more ways to protect areas from flooding beyond retention ponds, and seek balance between quality of built environment and associated cost. And then cultural preservation when it comes to African American Native history and indigenous lands and communities, ensuring that as we're building and expanding here in Charleston, that we're reminded, just the same way we would be for land, that there is a desire to preserve African American Native history and indigenous lands in the community for a sense of home and community. So our takeaways overall is what seems to be an overlying running from all of the sessions that were held, is that there's an overwhelming consensus to see consistency between the words and actions of the city in this plan. So there's a desire to, if people are participating, they want to make sure that whatever they shared or desire to see shows up in a codifying way to affect their lives in a better way based on the actions or responses to what was shared. There's more work to be done, and there's an understanding with that as it relates to improving diversity and community relationships. The community honestly just wants to see that there's a ongoing communication and engagement that happens between the city and all the things that are happening, as well as with the residents. The importance of synergy between the city departments with regards to the plan. There's, if questions come up and then it's connected to another department, they feel like it would be great if all departments or a representative would be connected so that all those questions or any thoughts can be shared at that time. Again, with engagement and communications aligning the overall feedback. Safety means different things to different people. The safety of some is often prioritized over the safety of others. There was just a concern for what does safety mean and how it's responded to if there's any concerns from residents. So just understanding that safety overall is desired by everyone, regardless of their race or economic status, socioeconomic status. Everyone desires safety, and safety is different for many different groups and what that looks like. So a good example overall of this takeaway is that we heard the experience of various residents and their views on development as not just a planning or financial issue, but also as a feeling of certain groups being unwelcomed or ignored when it comes to planning efforts. We also heard a desire for the city to solicit more authentic engagement, feedback, and input from communities impacted by the plan. And the overall goal is just again, communications and engagement, continue to communicate, because you can't do one without the other. And that's all the residents are really asking for. And just for an understanding overall that they want a safe quality of life, just like everyone else, but treated equitably, or see it as equitably across the board for every resident. And I am passing it back over to AJ to talk about round two, unless y'all want to ask questions before we say what we're going to do in round two. No questions at all. Okay, thank you, AJ.
All right, thank you, Satika. So in round two, the objective would be to share the findings from the analysis in round one engagement, present a draft plan recommendations, and then gather feedback. Our goals in round two would be to engage with populations who were not involved with round one. As Chloe shared on an earlier slide, we knew that we had an overrepresentation in predominantly white communities and higher socioeconomic statuses. Our intention in round two, however, is to not necessarily ignore those communities. We will definitely double back and re-engage them, but we'll also divert a lot more of our efforts into making sure that we get a greater percentage of tenants, younger individuals, members of the African-American community, also members of the older communities as well, and any of the geographic areas within the city that might not have been hit to the fullest. We want to build on the momentum of the engagement for round one. We feel that although COVID-19 has definitely hampered a lot of the engagement efforts, and as we see the numbers continuing to spike, we do want to come up with a creative strategy to make sure that people know that this plan is still being developed and that they're still being included, and their input and feedback is still desired. We want to ensure that the communication regarding the plan is effective, consistent, and authentic. As Satika said in an earlier slide, the residents that took part in the listening sessions and those who gave feedback on the surveys want to make sure that their input and feedback is going to contribute to the creation of this plan, and that the final plan will reflect that. And so we want to make sure that as we re-engage for round two, that assumption is lived up to on our part. Based on the data from round one, again, we said increased engagement among demographic groups that have historically not been engaged, and that are specifically African Americans, Latinx, Hispanic, college students, homeless populations, etc. I do want to take the time also to thank the planning department for their extreme flexibility and support in us being able to engage in round one. It was not by any stretch of the imagination an easy task, and as I think all of us on this call can attest to, we are definitely in different times in terms of how public contact and communication takes place. However, we feel confident that the first round was reflective of a genuine concerted effort on the part of not only ourselves as consultants, but the city planning department to engage as broad a representation of the city of Charleston as possible. So with that being said, I don't know if there are now any questions, or are we ready to move forward in the presentation?
Looks like Donna has a question.
I actually have several kind of comments and questions because I was taking some pictures of these slides as we went along, and I'm going to assume this presentation will be available in our Dropbox later. Chloe, can I make that assumption?
You can, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, but I was taking pictures as I went along because some things were standing out for me. And this might sound confusing right now because I was trying to put my head together, but I noticed that there are a lot of themes. But when I step back to what we actually have to do here, the comprehensive plan by state law has to have these 9 elements, and we've added resilience as an element. Did we ever break down all of these comments and themes in there as they relate to those elements? And are those elements like have certain priorities within regions of this city? Like, or for example, even though we have to look at all these elements and speak to them, there's some of these elements that have greater importance or resonate greater with a certain population in a certain part of the city. That's kind of a comment. And I'm glad to hear that we're doing round 2, because I've had a brief conversation with Chloe about that, because oftentimes, I mean, it took me a long time to understand what a comprehensive plan was. So I'm sure just the average citizen doesn't really know how to get their head around what a comprehensive plan means. And oftentimes people, when they come to a blank board, it's hard to write something on it. But when they see the synthesis that y'all have done so well, they go, wait a minute, I didn't realize that was part of it. And I have a comment toward that. So I'm glad there's going to be round 2 with a synthesis of these themes and ideas getting back into the community. But I've also had this thought that sometimes quantity of people is not as important as quality of people. And what I mean by that is to make sure that we've identified this underrepresented group. Do we even know who they are? And are there any leaders within that group, 2 or 3 people who have connections into the community, who can facilitate the understanding, the information, because even Fatika talked about lack of literacy within this. So, you know, that's a hard challenge. I know that we've been working on that very hard, but I just would hope that we made sure that you had a list of underrepresented. Tenants are going to be particularly hard. That's even true in my neighborhood where we're rentals. They don't even know they can participate in our neighborhood association because they think it's a homeowners association. We're constantly fighting that battle, even in my neighborhood. So I just want to kind of hear a little bit about how we're going to review all those themes that y'all gave and how we might engage further with these leaders of people that we don't even know exist. It's kind of like the known unknown. I think everybody on the call knows that we don't know some of these things, but how are we going to effectively get to the leaders, have them review this stuff? And I'm going to stop there because otherwise it starts becoming a big distracted conversation around this from my point of view. Thank you.
All right. I'm not sure if you were asking, Ms. Donna. I'll take a stab at it. And again, thank you for not only your question today, but your overwhelming support throughout this entire process, being in several of these listening sessions yourself and fielding questions and comments. And everything that you said is exactly true. And it's a part of the engagement strategy that we're putting forth in the second round, because we do recognize that we have to also concentrate our efforts in the underrepresented communities with an eye of making sure that not only are we providing them with the information and the opportunity for feedback, but in cases where it is in fact necessary, educating them on exactly what this is. And so we do have a couple of listings of community leaders, neighborhood organizations, and groups specifically that we will be reaching out to. And the planning department, Chloe specifically, has also facilitated kind of a infrastructure of how we will do that. Myself and Eric and the rest of our at the possibility of having kind of have a quick hit educational module for people who we will engage with that had no familiarity, no contact with the first round, because we know coming in to say, hey, do you want to participate in something that they have no familiarity with is going to be just like cold calling. However, I think because we have now compiled a draft report and we have this presentation, we do have some tools and resources that will be useful to us to kind of hit a high level of information that we can present to those individuals that you listed, and also kind of have a everyday man on the street type script that we can use to provide them the opportunity to give feedback if they so choose.
Thank you for that, AJ. And I want to reiterate my commitment. I will be there to listen. I've been trying to do that. I've been working with Chloe on the settlement community aspect, which is a little subset of all this. And I've met a lot of new people and found some people who have given us a lot of good information and feedback. So I'm still committed to that. I just wanted to also add a comment because this is something that Tika said, and I found it also part of the interesting discussion is that safety means different things to different people. And most of the time when we talk about safety, we just think about crime. And safety isn't just about crime. It's about feeling comfortable that my roof isn't going to leak when I go to sleep at night, or, you know, feeling that, you know, I won't be flooded when it floods. So there's different levels of safety, and I'm glad that y'all are expanding that definition to people, because I think that's real important that we understand. Things aren't just, you know, myopic criminal, and crime can be just like my neighbor is complaining about my yard all the time. There's just a social pressure of I'm made to feel uncomfortable in my neighborhood. Therefore, I feel unsafe going even into my yard to have a party because somebody's going to call about. And those are very tiny little things, but I'm really glad that y'all are looking at that, because I think that creates a dynamic about how we plan a neighborhood or how we plan community spaces and how we plan to encourage people to use those things that we're going to recommend in the plan, is that it is diverse and everybody feels safe in the space. So I'm glad y'all are adding these dimensions to it. And I'm going to stop now because I could go off on a lot of aspects right now. Thank you.
Well, Donna, I just wanted to state that honestly, we really did appreciate your presence at every meeting, and those that could pop in when they could. I will say that it did make a difference when, especially in the breakout sessions, when you were present, because you were in a lot of mine, where if a question came up or understanding of clarity, you were able to add back reference on behalf of the Planning Commission to answer a question or make something clear. And I feel like that was a part of the Literacy 101, because we can do our best to cram in as much to prep them before we get to the breakouts, but having someone there when you're having those conversations and start to talk and dialogue to help you understand what you're thinking about or what you should be thinking about, and answer any questions that are assumptions that you don't know that's happening, it does make a big difference. And just to add on to the last thing that you said, I think that's very important for people to understand. Community is different. The word community is used different for different groups of people. So within people of color, community is a sense of, it's all things. It's family, it's neighborhood, it's zip code, it's my friends, it's everything. That's community. When in majority of white communities, or that we heard with dialogue, might use neighborhood and think of community. So it's just different when we're talking about reference to where you live. When you hear someone talk about community, it's not minusing the city. It's stating that where I live is in whole, and everything I do in this space is my community. What the place where I live, just my zip code, is not just the neighborhood in which, but it's my community overall. So just want to make sure that's stated, because a lot of times that can be missed. And it's a good literacy lesson for all of us as we diversify our thoughts and our minds, as we continue to really have authentic engagement.
And I'm going to add, that's a strong point, because something y'all said about Johns Island wanted to stay rural and agricultural and not Charleston 2.0. Can't put a square peg in a round hole. I mean, we need to respect this basic character. West Ashley, quite suburban. Daniel Island, very planned community. The Peninsula, organic and old and historic. James Island, once again, a suburban, but at a different level. Johns Island, rural, but changing. So we need to respect that description, if you will, of these, what the mayor has called boroughs, before we just try to cram a plan of a square peg in a round hole to all of them. We need to understand their individualities first. And I think that's coming out loud and clear in those listening sessions. And then some of that compilation of things that y'all laid out. And then it helps us plan around that community that lives on Johns Island, you know. So thank you for that, Katika.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say to the team here how grateful I am for this outreach. I think it's safe to say that this is the most aggressive outreach we've done on a city plan. Christopher, you could probably speak to that better than anybody on this particular meeting. But I think for me, the phase 2, as important as phase 1 has been, phase 2 might be more important, because now, you know, we've got a draft, or we've got some ideas, and now we need to go test those. And I think the importance, I mean, every phase is important, so I don't want to overstate this, but getting a diverse group of people from all parts of the city looking at what our drafts are might be even more effective, because, you know, giving people a blank sheet of paper and saying, okay, what do you want? Can be difficult. I mean, I participated in our meeting here on James Island, and you know, the discussion was great. It was a great meeting, but it was, you know, kind of all over the map and not really focused. Well, now, you know, as Ms. Jacobs said, getting people to understand what a comp plan can be difficult. So now when they see what a draft looks like and they see the kinds of things we're addressing, I think being able to respond to the draft ideas that are being put out there is going to be really important. And so anyway, I'm grateful to this consultant team and all the hard work, and really, and it's such a challenging time, probably no more challenging a time has ever existed to try to get public feedback in a process like this. So tip of the cap, and thank you, and let's keep up the good work.
Thank you, Harry.
Thank you. And I do want to reiterate that we are so appreciative of the planning department, because again, planning for engagement in a pandemic, I think, is rather unprecedented. And especially when folks are afraid of physical contact and, you know, of course, this virus and its impact. But we still saw a lot of people in all of the sessions who were truly committed to seeing this plan be something that's beneficial for all. So I want to say that.
And Chloe, if I just have 1 second, I did want to add that what was a underlining thing that came out at times in conversations, that people actually, even though we had to by default do virtual, people really appreciated not having to drive downtown and find parking to get to a space to have a meeting. They really appreciated being able to log in in their home at a convenient time as a choice of two, and then be able to participate. I think that on top of that, Harry, what you might have sensed, we really tried hard to ensure that within these spaces that we had an hour and a half of everybody's attention, that it felt like community, it felt like connection, that we were engaging, you know, noticing things on people's screens, pulling out stuff, you know, trying to create that sense of, if you were in person, we would be noticing you, but to know that you're not just in a virtual space disconnected, but we're trying to create community as much as possible in this time that we have. I think that helped to break down some barriers, and maybe created that space area where you said like people were all over. Maybe people felt excited just to be able to share with people about what they were going through, and to hear those like-minded conversations and challenges, and also pluses that they love about Charleston. So we are definitely going to continue that. And our team was very committed to creating that kind of space, and the planning department was on board with that too. So it was great. We had a great time. We really did.
I think Angie has her hand up.
Yeah.
I do. I just wanted to add, I'm obviously in a car waiting room here, but I wanted to add, thank you so much for all you're doing. I learned a lot through this. I just wanted to share that I appreciate everything. So great education, and just wanted to thank you for all you're doing, and look forward to the next section.
We are too. Thank you.
Right. Before we move on to our housing updates, Eddie Vines, staff with Housing and Community Development Department, do you still have a question, Eddie? I saw you raise your hand earlier. Oh, okay. We can come. Oh, no, we'll come back to him. Okay.
Chloe, I just wanted to state that if, because Julie or Eric didn't get a chance to speak, if they wanted to say something before we moved on. I didn't know if they wanted to. If not, we'll keep going.
Chloe? No, just look forward to round two.
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify that. I think that's critical, as Harry said earlier. And I think what you're going to find, what you will probably find in some of these communities, it's just that what they are most afraid of is that with all of the development moving on and down on the peninsula and other fringes of the city, is that their community will not get the same type of attention and still be called their community. The nuances and all of the important thing that they grew up with, they want to see that. A good example would be, somebody mentioned Johns Island. I know there's a lot of excitement about the development on Johns Island, for example. And and there are a lot of historic places on Johns Island. And I think that once folks see that there is a genuine concern that those communities will be restored or redeveloped, and therefore that the legacy that has been there for years with all the people that have grown up there and have done so much for that area, that's an educational piece in itself. So preserving their history, their neighborhood history is important. And so when AJ, and Ms. Robbins, when you go back, I think that is the thing that has to be amplified, that they know that. And they may not say that, but I can tell you that that's what they're thinking. Another one is, I don't know what we're doing with Hughie, Canehorn, Basic. They've been talking about doing development in an area for years, 20 years, 30 years maybe. And there are people who have, they see what happened with Daniel, with the larger part of Daniel Island, but their hamlet in a part of that neighborhood of that area, that's what they're looking for. That's the genuineness that will give this credence and will give this trust and confidence that that their neighborhood is not going to be built up and they be left out of it. What I'm saying is, for a place like Canehorn, for example, they don't want to see that area developed so that somebody comes and build a beautiful mansion back there and put all these big fences up. I mean, that has to stop, So probe that question when you go there so that you can make sure, once you can show and demonstrate that this is what's going to happen, at the end of the day, all of the communities will be well recognized. People that helped build the communities will be recognized, and that legacy will be there for the young people that still live there. We can see that. So I think that is critical. But otherwise, I think everything you've said, the reports that have come out have made a lot of sense. I think Chloe has worked very hard, Miss Chloe. And if that continues, then it's everybody wins. Mr. Jackson, you agree with that?
Yes, sir. We appreciate your words. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I appreciate that too. This is Julie. I just wanted to elevate some of the things that were said, I think really about Estatika's comments about community and neighborhood. And in some of the neighborhoods, I mean, really the difference, I think even there's a difference between, Donna, your neighborhood and the neighborhoods that are a planned neighborhood that has been marketed for years and, really recently in years to sell homes as it's a commercial, and there's a lot of money and effort behind those neighborhoods. And a lot of rules and a lot of other things that are really different. So I think what I heard in Mr. Bynes' comment that was so strong is that a lot of the neighborhoods that are not, they don't want to be the planned neighborhood of the new neighborhoods, but they do want to be acknowledged for their structure, what they have, and not just seen as something waiting to be planned, but as something that already does have a planning. So I thought that was something that really came up that was really interesting to me. And I will also encourage, I think, Donna, as you were saying, and as it came up as well, is as a group, perhaps at a workshop or something else, to really consider having a deep discussion about safety and what safety means. This process took place in a time where a lot of feelings were raw about that topic on a lot of different, there were a lot of other things that were going on beyond just this planning exercise. And I think that a lot of times that a lot of our rules and a lot of our planning and zoning is done about safety and different things, and kind of what does that mean to y'all, and what does and how can the planning department, how can the planning process be a place that one of the safeties that we protect is the dignity of all the people. So with that, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure, and it just the principles that y'all set out from the beginning, watching those really be held up and utilized has just been amazing. And I've really been honored to be on this team and to be with all of y'all.
Thanks everyone so much for your great commentary. And thank you, Eddie, for also sharing. For everyone here who does not know Eddie, he's the manager of the city's rehabilitation programs. Has been with the city for a very long time. Appreciate Eddie for being here and for sharing that. We have a lot still to cover, updates from our housing analysis team and our water and land use team. So I'll go ahead and Jim, do you want me to share the slides again, or would you prefer to? Jim, okay, can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
Now we can hear you.
Yeah, so I think it's fine if you share the slide. They're in the same slideshow that you were showing before. So if you don't mind.
Sure.
And I'm just going to turn it over to our housing analysis consultants with community data platforms. Oh, actually, Chloe, you might need to refresh your screen because I was playing with it a little bit during the presentation. Great. Yeah, so I'll turn it over to our consultants with community data platforms. I think we have with us Anna Tapp and Remy Beveridge. And yeah, I'm not sure which one of you would like to present, but go ahead and chime in.
Hey everybody, my name is Remy Beveridge. Thanks for the introduction, Jim. I am a project manager for community data platforms, and with me I have Anna Tapp. She is our lead data scientist, and so we will be giving an update on the housing analysis and then fielding any questions that come up or comments, concerns, any of the above. And so we just kind of, to talk about it, you just heard a lot about the stories that are being told by the community members, and kind of where we come in is talking about the story that the housing stock itself tells and how that plays into the comprehensive plan. So go ahead, Jim. All right, so the first story that we want to talk about is the current housing stock. And so as you can see, we have, we decided to look at the households in 2020, the projected households in 2030, as the comprehensive plan is for 10 years. And those numbers were developed by the population projections that we got from the city. We also took into account the current number of units. And then one piece that we know to be really important based on the city plan is zoning. And so what Anna did was took a deep dive into Charleston's zoning codes and was able to do an analysis on what was the maximum number of units allowable by current zoning. So is this something that needs updated? Is this something that needs changed to account for the number of people that will be here in 2030? So as you can see, we have about 84,000 households in 2020, 97,000 projected households in 2030. We have 93,000 current number of units, but then there's a lot of room for zoning. You can see as that number is almost 174,000 units. Then the next part of our analysis was breaking this down by zoning category.
Harrison, I did have one question. When you said by the current zoning, are we talking about current zoning in the city of Charleston or the landscape of West Ashley, Johns Island, James Island, because some of that is actually within the county. And then, of course, so I'm curious as to, are we talking about just our zoning and lots or properties that are currently within the city of Charleston?
Anna?
Our study area was inside the urban growth boundary. So it's a combination, and it was allowable zoning density within the urban growth boundary. So there is a bit in the county. So I think Jim and Chloe as planners could probably state it a little bit better, but it's generally inside the urban growth boundary, includes an area of overlap between the city and the county where they work together from a planning perspective. Jim, do you want to go into more detail on that, or?
Yeah, I think as most of us know, there are lots of areas that are, lots of subdivisions and neighborhoods that are kind of mixed city and county incorporated. And so we have a lot of, especially out on Johns Island and James Island, we have a lot of areas that fall within multiple jurisdictions within the urban growth boundary. And I think for our planning purposes, we thought it made sense to stay, to look at the housing stock within the urban growth boundary as a whole, rather than try to, kind of extrapolate different things from these little pockets of, one city home here and so on and so on. But I think one thing to note here as well with this, you see this huge number, maximum number of units allowable. A lot of that includes things that aren't homes, of course. So we have residential density that's allowed in our zoning code for industrial properties and things that aren't being utilized as housing, but are still going to be included in that count. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
And I have one other question. Your title says housing affordability analysis. Do these units represent all the affordable housing or just all the units in the area?
They include all the units in the area. And then as we get further down, this is kind of broken up into sections in the final deliverable. It'll all be together. But this is all households. And then we'll talk more about particular affordable housing units farther down.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And so then here we have broken down the total housing stock by zoning category. And for the purposes of presenting it, we worked with the planning department to break down into different categories. So obviously there are more than these 7 options of zoning. So there's more than commercial, mixed use, industrial, Daniels Island, and so on. But for the purposes of presentation, we decided to group into these zoning categories. So you can see that how the different zoning categories are seen in different areas in Charleston. Okay, and then one of the other really important pieces that our team was tasked with was understanding this idea of being cost burdened. And so someone or a household is cost burdened when they're spending more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage. And this is taken from HUD's definition of being cost burdened. And so what we found was over 40% of people in the city of Charleston are cost burdened. So that means over 40% of people are spending more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage or on their housing costs. And we'll look at the next slide to understand how important that is. Okay, so really quickly, just to understand this analysis, on the right-hand side, you'll see a picture of a beaker. And this is for illustrative purposes only. So how the blue goes into the 875 and how it measures up, that is not directly indicative of the numbers in Charleston. This is just for illustrative purposes. So just wanted to frame by saying that. So again, as we said, over 40% of Charleston households are cost burdened, which means that over 40% of them are spending more than 30% of their pre-tax income on housing needs. And so how we can take this illustration is that it's a compounding effect, and that when people are forced, if there's not enough inventory, there's not enough supply for them in their affordable bracket, they have to then jump into the next bracket. So what this illustration shows is that there are the blue level, that's how many households need affordable housing within the range of 0 to 625. But there's only so many affordable housing options. So what happens is these people have to jump into the next, and they take away some of the inventory from the people who would have an affordable range from $625 to $875. And just a little bit more context, these numbers came from the AMI values that the Planning and Housing Department use most often. So then just to continue on that illustration, we can see now we're actually looking, the red range of people are those who their affordable housing would be between $625 and $875. And so when they get poured in, most of their stock is already gone. And so what they have to do is then they jump into the next level of stock. So when a resident spends more than 30% of their income, they pull from the affordable inventory of another group of people. And again, the word compounding has come up. This has a compounding effect because the affordable supply becomes smaller and smaller. So you can see even in this case, the people who are kind of this darker blue, they're not getting any of their affordable housing stock. They technically should be where the red is, but because that stock has already been taken, they're unable to find affordable housing for themselves. Okay, and so we're moving on into looking at the housing supply versus the income. And so the important thing to preface here is that this is looking at supply only. So this is looking at the number of units that would be affordable for a certain group of people. It is not matching me living in my house and how much I make. It's just looking at supply. And so what we see here is there are over 10,000 households who are in the 30% AMI bin. So they're making less than $24,000 a year. Only over 5,000 units are affordable for them. And so we can see on the far right column, we see this big mismatch. So there is a need for over 5,000 units for that income bin. And so that's kind of how you read this chart is you can look in the first column and we see the AMI income bins and they go up obviously. Then we see the number of households who fit in that bin. So the number of households that are making that much money, then the number of units that are affordable for those income bands. And then we can see the mismatch. And again, just to reiterate, this is looking at the supply and not looking at individual people and their incomes together. Anything Anna or Jim want to say for this slide?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that our goal for this is to determine if the supply and the policy in and of itself were sufficient for everybody to be housed at an affordable rate. And it is a completely ideal situation. So imagine you kicked everybody in the city of Charleston out of their house and you tried to put everybody in a house with a market rate that they could afford. That the situation in Charleston right now, regardless of the choices people make, it's not possible to do that. So we felt like that would be a very helpful starting point in terms of planning to ensure you could look at this and you could see, are the number of units even available, regardless of the decisions people make about what neighborhood they would like to live in, what school district they would like to live in, just as a whole and by planning district. And that would be very helpful for policy and planning in the future. So that was the goal behind this, and to also make sure that the zoning in these different areas was, that it was sufficient that density could happen.
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure I understand this slide and the previous slide. Is this the slide that's on the screen now? Is it said another way, is it that the greatest need for number of units is at that lowest income band? And then the previous slide, I think the way I should interpret that is that if we somehow could fix the lowest income bucket stock, it would create sort of a self-leveling upstream that would provide more opportunities all the way up, maybe into the 50%, the 60%, et cetera. Is that how I should interpret that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think, so yes, and that's not all, because what this is showing, and Anna did a good job of explaining this, but this is just showing, do the units exist or not? It does not talk about actual availability. So whether someone else is living there or not, and whether they have any plans of moving anytime soon. So it's just, do they exist and not if they're available? And so there's still another layer of analysis that has to be done in terms of actual supply, actual availability. And that for that, we're going to be looking into the percent of folks who are cost burdened and breaking that down, looking into the different income brackets. And so, for example, our housing department has a lot of their efforts are focused on the 80 to 120% range. And this, if you looked at this, this would show that, well, we have a surplus of that. But when you look at the reality of where people are living and what they're paying, it doesn't exactly match up. So we have to look at both. Does it exist? But then also look at availability.
If I could chime in as well, I think that this graphic is more easily understood if with the following slide that kind of puts it into more context. And so, as Chloe just mentioned, if you were to look at this at face value, you might think, okay, we might have a surplus of units affordable to someone making 100% AMI. But if you'll flip to the next slide, please. So here, these numbers are taken from the ACS. So they're not, they don't quite match up with what CDP has produced for us, but I think they're a good reference point. And so just to be totally clear, they're not coming from the same sources of data, but just as a reference point, I think they're helpful. So here you can see that, they're at that 100% AMI level. We still have, around 50% or more cost burden households around the city. So I think what you're seeing on the previous slide is that while we might have units, we don't have the people that are making that bracket occupying a lot of those units. And so that's kind of the idea we wanted to kind of wrap our head around, how does our supply stack up with what people are experiencing in reality? And what we can see is we kind of have an inefficiency, if you will. I mean, obviously this isn't a complete idealized world where we could take people out of their homes and then put them in one that would be perfectly affordable to their situation, which is we wouldn't want to do and is also unfeasible. But so I think these two slides together kind of paint a clearer picture that, our real problem is that we have people that are living in homes that aren't really necessarily within their affordability requirements.
And I think the other way to frame is to think that the slide previously is devoid of people's choices and it's devoid of outside factors except for the available units. So I might not be able to live in Daniel Kanehoy because my job is over here and I don't have adequate transportation. And so whatever unit may not be available to me in that situation. But this slide is solely just looking at me as having a certain income and then looking at the housing supply. So it's not looking at me as an individual necessarily. So I think that's just another important framework that we have to keep in mind.
And I'm glad you put that into context because my job might be on the peninsula, but the only affordable housing is way out on Johns Island and I don't have a car. So, right. I'm glad you added that context to the discussion because that was in my head. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, like we said, it's important numbers to know, to see even devoid of choices, do we even have the stock? And then we add in choices and see how does it fare. So I think, Jim, if you go to 2 more slides, we do take into account choices. Okay, so what this does is it takes into the choices of people staying in their current neighborhood. And so this is the supply, the necessary supply needed to account for cost burdenness, to account for future residents, so those who would come from now until 2030, accounting for those two things, what sort of supply do we need? And so these are the total number of units. And in the final handoff, they will be broken down by AMI value, like you just saw. So it'll say, out of this 600 units, we need X amount at the 30% AMI level, we need X amount at the 50% AMI level, and so on and so forth.
And how did we get to that number? Maybe I missed that in the explanation. How did you determine that there are 600 people that are currently living on Cane Hoy, or will be living on Cane Hoy that need this? How are these numbers determined?
Anna?
So we pulled in different commercial data sources to help us with this, to enhance what's available in the census, in order for us to create, custom aggregations that jive with your planning district. So our commercial data sources are 95% of households at an address point level. So in that way, we were able to aggregate in a variety of ways. And some of the data that we're going to be providing the city even goes down to neighborhood in terms of who's there and what's the family income or the household income like.
That's a huge pressure on West Ashley right there. I'm just noticing that. Thank you.
And our assumption also, Donna, is that the configuration of the neighborhood will be steady between now and 2030. So we, for the sake of projecting, if, for example, a certain district had 20% at one AMI, we projected the population increase, but that AMI level, what do we need for that to stay 20% so that you preserve the diversity within these planning districts?
Another important note is to eliminate housing cost burdens as well. So, as we've shown, the city as a whole and the individual areas of the city are heavily cost burdened, some more so than others. And so this is to reduce those cost burdens back to 30%. So this is another idealized scenario. It's not to keep the current level of cost burdenness and keep that same level to 2030.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much. We'll hand it back over to Jim and Chloe.
Okay. So we didn't want to share all of that without also taking a look at how the city's been doing so far in terms of generating affordable units citywide. And so this data here is reflective of all affordable housing development, whether it's the City of Charleston that's doing the development, or the City of Charleston Housing Authority, or a private developer. And this is a 20-year snapshot, so all units between since 2000. 37% of all new units, all new or preserved units in the last 20 years were built or preserved in the last 20 years, 19% in the last 10 years. 11% of these were homeownership, 89% were rental, 8% were for the area median income range of households making between 80 and 150%, or often called workforce housing. 20% were for those making 60 to 80% the area median income, 21% making for those making 30 to 60% the area median income, and 51% for those making up to 30% of the area median income. The way that funding works for affordable housing oftentimes has expiration dates on when that affordability restriction is no longer required. And so 148 units the affordability of them expired for 148 units in the last 20 years. Based on the current schedule, 579 more units are scheduled to expire by 2030. And at least 26% of all of these units that were built since 2000 were partially or fully funded by the city. So, yes.
I have a question about that. So even though we're looking at raw numbers of what units are either affordable, be they home ownership or rental, and originally in this originally at the beginning we talked about underrepresented. So on a basis of who is utilizing our units that are partially or fully funded by the city, where does that stand? Because if we're talking about affordability and Black African American were underrepresented in the conversation, are they also underrepresented in the use of the affordable housing units that are either available or would potentially become available?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Erica. Could you repeat, please?
Essentially, what I'm asking is, are the folks who are occupying these units that are either set to be expired or hopefully will come online, have we, where does that demographic land between represented and underrepresented?
Gotcha. I do not have an answer for you in terms of, I have not done that analysis. But I will say that the number of units that expired since 2000 would have been higher without, were there no intervention. So there are opportunities for intervention to preserve affordable housing units. So several hundred were preserved since 2000. It kept that number lower than it could have been. So it's not a done deal. It's not, it doesn't have to expire if there are interventions. And we have housing staff here that can speak more to that, that might be able to answer your question better than I can. Like that's a little bit more in their realm of the work that they're doing.
Sure, this is Matt Ojala with the Housing and Community Development Department. I'm not sure I still totally understand the premise of the question, but I'm happy to to chat with you offline to drill further down into it. And as Chloe said, we have an understanding of which units are expiring, but we'd have to do some more analysis on, I think, to answer your question.
Okay.
Any other questions on housing analysis before we move on?
I do. And I think this might, I had to deal with something for a minute, so this might have to back up on Erica's question. Is there a plan as these expire to fill the bucket? In other words, there needs to be an equilibrium plan, because I know that currently there have been some plans that have come before us where we've been, given affordable housing in perpetuity, which is kind of a new thing. Usually it had a 10-year or 25-year time frame, and people began to notice that 25 years is kind of a mortgage time. So essentially, if somebody owns the house for its entire 25 years and then, pays the mortgage and then sells it for whatever reason, they've lost it. So I think we need to think about what I would call an equilibrium plan, where things are going out of this bucket of affordability and coming into this bucket as we move forward. And back at the very early part of this, we were talking, and a question came to my mind. It says, just because we have enough by zoning, is it enough in the proper places? And I kind of grazed on that, and we kind of said something about that, but I want to just reiterate that we have to make sure that we are not placing affordable units in places where there isn't a transportation hub or there isn't the work. Like for a lot of people that work on the peninsula, require affordable housing. And if the zoning is appropriate in outer West Ashley for that, that just makes it inconvenient and burdensome on other levels to bring them in. So I just want to reiterate that point. And I know that we're looking at affordable housing here now, but when they broke down the zoning, there was an element of commerce in there. And I think we need to continue to think about affordable commercial space too for these small businesses, so that people can kind of live, work, and play if they're an entrepreneur in the same space. So thank you for that opportunity to comment.
Yeah, and before we move on, I'm sorry, Anna.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to say, at the planning district level, the story is still the same. So the different ways that we've looked at it so far, the zoning is sufficient. So I just wanted to comment on that before we move forward.
I wanted to just say thank you for this team. I mean, to the team, I think we all sort of knew intuitively that we have an affordability problem in Charleston. I think what this data does for me anyway is it communicates very clearly the magnitude of the problem. Even if we replicated the highest number of unit production in any year that was on that graph you showed us, Chloe, we're still drastically below where we need to be. So, this just crystallizes the extent and the magnitude of the problem. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think there's some daunting numbers in this section of the presentation. When you look at the fact that we have 80 some odd thousand units available now, I think was the number, and there's zoning available for double that or more than double that. Yet so many in our community feel like overdevelopment and huge buildings are, such a big challenge for our community. But then you look at the number or the deficiency in affordable units. I did the quick math, they would fill 80 Joseph Floyd Manors. So, I mean, it is an interesting mix of things to be thinking about on the housing front for sure. It is sobering.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we really appreciate all the great work from community data platforms, and they've been a pleasure to work with. And I know the engagement team got some shout outs earlier, so I definitely wanted to make sure these people felt the love too, because it's been a really tough project. And we have insights now that we've never had before, and more coming as well. So just a big shout out to that team and all the great work they've done.
Jim, Remy, or Anna, would y'all mind just saying very briefly what is coming that we we're not presenting today, but that we will have along with the draft plan?
So I think one of the biggest insights that is coming is cost burdenness taking into account transportation. And so one of the stories that we heard from Jim and Chloe as they kind of relate it to us was that, yeah, cost burden as taking into account housing is part of it. But we also have to take into account housing and transportation, because if I moved way out to get cheaper housing, but now my transportation costs have increased, that was that trade-off. And so part of what is coming is cost burden numbers, again, by plan district, that take into account both housing and transportation as factors that contribute to the cost burdenness. So as as imagined, those cost burden numbers go up even more when we take into account transportation. So that's probably the biggest insight that's also coming that wasn't in this presentation.
And then I think the underlying data sets and GIS deliverables that CDP is going to be giving us, I think it can't be understated how important that's going to be. I think for us and for the Housing and Community Development Department, they're going to be incredible resources that we can go to answer some questions that we didn't even, have the capacity to ask at this point. So we're going to have, all of the data that they have created for us, and then some other stuff that's been organized and compiled in a really helpful way for us. So we'll get the keys to the car and have the ability to do some of our own analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Jim and Chloe. You guys have been a pleasure to work with too. Anna and I always look forward to our meetings. So we've really learned a lot too. I think Anna and I have had multiple conversations about different ways that choice does play in, right? And that kind of, Donna, like you were talking about, it is really important to separate choice to look just at the stock, but then we do have to take choice and we have to take context and we have to take all of this into consideration. And so we've really enjoyed getting to learn about that as well.
I want to bounce off of Jim's comment. That's good to hear that in addition to the sort of overview that we've been giving, there's specific buckets of data that are compiled under different headings or analysis so that a secondary layer of analysis can be put on that, maybe this time next year if it's necessary, but that the data is being given right now to y'all for that number crunching. That's really encouraging to hear. So thank you for that.
And I think, for me sitting here listening to both the community engagement presentations and then this, and particularly Remy with what you just said about the transportation piece, this just really highlights to me the necessity of emphasizing transit-oriented development, like that's just going to be a really important piece of the future of this city. If this region's going to work, we're going to have to combine the availability of transportation with the availability of housing. Those two have just got to work together. So, from my standpoint, that's really what these two presentations we've heard today sort of highlight for me, among a lot of other things, but that's an important one.
And also the development of jobs when we go out and market to bring economic growth here, that we start talking about, well, if you're going to build a hotel somewhere and we know that we're going to need, workers for that hotel, what are your thoughts about your employees and how they can be, as Harry mentioned, transited in or housed? That becomes part of that development discussion, that we don't just, okay, great, we have a new hotel with job opportunities, but everybody's got to live in the hinterland to get there. That doesn't help in all the problems that are created there secondarily. So it's good to hear that we're going to have that information to begin as part of that conversation to somehow incentivize economic development as well as affordable housing within that. So that's good news. Thank you so much.
All right, Chloe, I think we're ready to move to the next presentation.
All right, do y'all have room in your brain still for the next part? All right. Passing it to Andy.
All right. Just try to share my screen here. All right, can y'all see that? And hear me okay? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, hello again. I'm Andy Sternett at Wagner Ball in New Orleans, and thanks for this opportunity to talk to you all again. The planning department asked us to just review with you briefly, since you've heard some of this already over the past few months, just review the framework of our work and then zoom in a little bit on some of the particular areas that are particularly suitable for variety of different reasons, for development or for redevelopment or for revisiting, based on their safety from flooding, to highlight that word again from earlier in the conversation. So I'm just going to go through quickly an overview, some overview slides here. Oops, this will click through. And then I'll spend a little more time on some zoom ins, because I know the screen is small for everyone, and to give you a chance to ask some questions, and would welcome questions. I've also got Lex Agnew from our office here to help me with any more detailed questions. So just a brief overview here of our approach. We were charged to look at the land and water context in Charleston for the comp plan. We started looking at elevation zones and identifying risk for various different types of water risk based on where you fall in relation to sea level. And then we looked at the watershed impacts. So how do you affect your surroundings and your neighbors? How do your neighbors impact you? Your upstream neighbors, how does your runoff affect your downstream neighbors? How does land cover within your watershed affect flood risk? And then we did an environmental sensitivity overlay. So coming up from the sea, you have marsh migration, some other sensitive environments along the coastal edge. And then working from the top down, you've got some particularly sensitive upland forest conditions, and otherwise across the city and the region, sensitivity regarding tree cover and infiltration in the soil, different types of soil infiltration for runoff. So here's kind of the overview of the elevation map, and I should say that these are all still kind of draft right now for the next little while. So kind of an overview elevation map. This was the part of the environmental sensitivity analysis, looking at marsh migration through different sea level rise scenarios. So what areas are at risk, what current marsh areas are at risk of being lost, and where will that marsh naturally try to migrate as sea levels are projected to continue to rise. Tree canopy analysis. These are all the regional maps in the final data set to the city. This is all GIS based, so it's zoomable to any level. And we've also produced a set of maps per each of these focus areas, and then even a little more zoomed in, what I'll show you today, to get down to a final level of resolution. So tree canopy and where it's been lost over the last 15 to 20 years or so. And then soils analysis. So where are soils best for infiltrating stormwater or runoff, and with all of the benefits that come from that within watersheds and downstream conditions. I'll just hold here for 1 second. One of the key balancing acts for the future in Charleston is this high ground condition. So in many environments around the city, the highest elevation, the highest land elevation corresponds to sensitive ecologies, sensitive cultural histories, and also sensitive soil types. So the places where you might naturally choose to concentrate development on high ground have a suite of factors that need to be balanced and weighed against those choices. That's something that we're not necessarily recommending what that balance is through this process, but that'll be the work of the city moving into policy going forward. So we also looked at different watershed types, classified watersheds by small and large. That's important because the larger watersheds tend to have more of that compounding risk as you move downstream. So kind of like the housing analysis showed, if you have that, if the bottom rung of the ladder is overburdened, you have compounding risk all the way up. Similar in a watershed, depending on what happens at the top, if you're running off too much water at the top of the watershed, that flood risk compounds all the way down. And if you're in a large tidal watershed, the increasingly high tides coming up from the bottom, from the sea, can compound flood risk when it rains all the way up through that system. So that works both ways. Within the watersheds, we looked at structure types and vulnerabilities. This was based on the vulnerability analysis by Nemat Fernleaf, finished just recently last year. So we used their same criteria and their same data that the city already had to get a handle on how many properties are at risk in addition to type of runoff to expect. So that's basically looking at properties in the floodplain or properties built before the new BFE requirements. And so all of that analysis together creates this sort of composite view. So we've split the city and the region into basically three zones: a high ground, an adapt zone, and then a tidal flood risk zone. Within each of those zones, there's a differentiation between high impact and low impact. That is, properties that and watersheds where that risk of compounding risk is greater, or relatively greater or less. So that's the distinction within that color change within. And I'll zoom in here and we'll take a closer look. So this is not to recommend that all development or all attention should be focused on the high ground. There are different strategies throughout each of these zones. And like I mentioned, different trade-offs that need to be weighed. One of those is landscape type and ecology. So working from the bottom up from that tidal zone, you have the coastal edge community. This is the marsh, salt marsh wetland, and where that salt marsh will tend to migrate. Through the adapt zone is predominantly a lowland floodplain, and then working up the sides of some of these ridges, natural old barrier island ridges. And then the upland ridges themselves, areas such as the Maybank corridor on Johns Island or Clements Ferry corridor in Canehoy, these higher ground upland ridges with sandy soils much more suitable for infiltration. And then throughout the developed part of the city, opportunities for reforestation and protecting existing tree cover. So all of that analysis together, we come up with 4 strategies: grow, defend, adapt, and reserve. And I won't get into too much specifics here, but it's not, these 4 strategies don't correspond to the zones: high ground, adapt zone, and tidal flooding zone. Reserve, for instance, runs throughout. We talked about the tree canopy, salt marsh, and upland forest. And adapt can mean a whole suite of things, depending on where you are. These zones, I should say, these zones are subtly different across the city: high ground, adapt zone, tidal flood risk. They change. There's a couple of feet difference, perhaps, across different areas based on local characteristics. So that's also not cut and dry. This is a pretty nuanced look at the city. So broad strokes here: where does grow, defend, adapt, reserve play out across those elevation-based zones? So naturally, growth should makes more sense in the adapt and the high ground. Defend means different things where you are, depending on your risk, whether that's risk from tidal flooding or risk from a compound flood, that is a high tide and a rain event happening at the same time. Adapt is throughout, reserve essentially throughout. And in the broader analysis, the more detailed information to the city, there's a whole matrix and suite of things that's broken down per risk zone, per place. These aren't policy recommendations. These are physical features. So some of these might be more appropriate for a homeowner to do on their own land. Some of them are more civic scale design ideas, physical space ideas. So there's much more information. That's kind of an overview of our analysis, the concepts, and some results. And a lot more where that came from for the city to parse through. Maybe I'll pause there for a second and see if there are any questions. Coming up here, I'm planning to go around focus by focus and take one particular place to zoom in and just see what these mean.
Very quick
I
question.
have a quick question.
Okay, go ahead, Angie.
Thanks, Donna. The map that you showed probably 4 or 5 slides back that showed the drainage and the poor drainage area, which was predominantly pink, I believe, at least that's what it showed up on my device. Is that taking into account development in those areas, or is it just the condition of the soil underlying the development? So for example, the peninsula and Daniel Island were both showing poor drainage. Is that from the permeable surface, or are you talking about the soil beneath?
This is the soil beneath. So
Okay.
this is irrespective of the land cover, except in certain places on the peninsula, soil data wasn't available due to the existing land cover.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
You have a map that's associated with your colored adapt chart, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
This one. Is there an overlay map that shows where not the redevelopment property, but let's say undeveloped property is within all of those zones? Is there a map that overlays that you've done? So in other words, all this marsh migration area, how much of that is developed now, or is there even opportunities there where we would kind of make a policy based on that?
I don't know if we've produced those maps. Okay. Only because it's so fine grained.
Right.
And especially on places that are largely built out where it's infill based development or redevelopment, you have to get in so tight. So if there are particular areas, and maybe we can revisit this question when on some of the zoom ins and see if that's needed.
I'm particularly thinking about Johns Island, James Island, and Cainhoy, because there are large areas that are very quickly. We heard in the community engagement that development on James Island is too high and too much and too fast. And we know on Johns Island that it's moving very aggressively also. And then with Cainhoy, that's our high ground, but they said, please leave us alone out there in some respects. So it would be nice to know in those sensitive areas, maybe where the key sensitive properties are that fall within some of these zones. Maybe it doesn't need a fine grain of the whole city. Maybe it just needs to be problem spotted a little bit, because that would create policy later for the planning department. I'm not sure if that's too much to ask. It's just kind of y'all know better than I do how hard that might be to do, but that's kind of the concept.
No, it's a great question. And I think we hold that thought for a second too, as we go through, and maybe we can see what overlay layers are needed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll start with Inner West Ashley. And then I'm gonna take a further zoom here in a minute along the Sam Rittenberg corridor. But just at this scale here to see where the high and low ground roughly is occurring. So looking at the brown up to 25 feet, some areas very slightly above 25 feet. But most of the Inner West Ashley area is in the kind of 8 to 12 foot range or so above sea level, above current mean sea level. Here's those soil types again. So this area is largely built out and doesn't correspond exactly to that sand infiltration on the high ground the way that other places do, like Johns Island or Cainhoy, but still you see where the relatively better soils are for infiltration. And that green soil hydrologic group A or B. And then marsh migration in a 3-foot sea level scenario. So yellow or orange here being marsh that is at risk of being lost, and light blue being areas that would naturally see expanded salt marsh area. And so the composite map, and you see this area of green, of darker green along the Sam Rittenberg corridor, where so that represents, and I'm just going to hold here for a second to look at the recommendations on the left. But I'll explain that darker green here on the next slide. So Inner West Ashley, significant areas are outside of the 100-year floodplain, which is good. But within the floodplain, many structures were built prior to BFE. That indicates they might be built too low or below current regulations, and therefore at risk of greater risk of flooding from their upstream or downstream neighbors. High ground, like I said, primarily along Rittenberg. Areas well suited for infiltration, soil well suited for infiltration in this area. And Importantly here in Inner West Ashley, a lot of the watersheds and urban watersheds are what we've classified as small watersheds, where that risk of compounding effect from runoff is not typically as great. However, because the drainage system, there are so many constrictions in the drainage system, the potential for compounding flood effect is amplified in many areas here. We see that drainage connections under the Greenway or under Savannah Highway, around the Citadel Mall, Long Branch Creek, some of these areas where the drainage backups have clear consequences. So just zooming in a little bit on Sam Rittenberg, and I put this aerial map in case we want to come back and reference kind of relative hardscape versus see what's existing there. But that dark green area represents high ground with relatively low impact on downstream structures or communities. So that's places that this analysis would suggest are most suitable for denser development with a suite of mitigating stormwater features, but that have less potential to impact their surrounding structures in the watershed. So I think this reinforces a little bit some of the long-range planning for this area as a potential site for greater density. Now, again, that's not something we're recommending, but that's a policy, a route for the city to explore through policy. Any questions here on Inner West Ashley or this area in particular? I think this is as tight in as the scale gets, Donna, so you can maybe imagine on a map like this where we could overlay those redevelopment zones.
Well, and I think I may have asked the question too soon because it's already these zoomable maps that you're showing sort of give enough of an indication as it is. So thank you.
Okay, I'll keep moving through. This is just a little pit stop in each place, so there's always more that could be shown. If anyone notices a gap or something that needs more elaboration, please let us know. So the same set here to see relative elevations. This might look a little more varied than actually in practice. This is a very flat landscape. So we bumped up the contrast to emphasize the change. Again, we see soil types here. This is essentially a pre-development look at the soils in this area, especially in the lighter green up around Outer West Ashley. There's a history of the phosphate mines that disrupted some of these characteristics. So those disruptions are not necessarily factored into this level of soil data. And then we see some of the marsh migration areas here moving up, tending to move up the creeks into more of the headwaters of the creeks, especially around Rantles here in the kind of bottom left of this image, one of the primary places identified for marsh migration in the region. Largely undeveloped currently, and largely outside of the urban growth boundary, even beyond the frame of this map. So we get to the overall risk and impact. This Outer West Ashley area includes the upper areas of Church Creek. And that's a place with a high number of vulnerable parcels, high potential impact for everything downstream Church Creek, the whole watershed basin. Much of the high ground is located in these high impact watersheds. So that means it's especially important what happens on those high grounds in relation to everything else downstream. In this area, like Inner West Ashley, waterways and floodplains are interconnected, both natural and man-made interconnections. So that has a tendency to multiply the potential impacts of flooding. Soil infiltrations, sometimes compromised by former uses like phosphate mining. This area, you'll see or you saw in an earlier map of the tree canopy, high tree canopy loss in this area over the last 2 decades or so. And like I mentioned, marsh migration is high, especially in Rantles Creek. So zooming in here to the River Road area, just zooming in on this portion of dark green, the low impact, high ground portion. You see in the lighter green, it's these areas, so Church Creek is there kind of running left to upper left to bottom right through this image. See if I can point here. Here's Church Creek running through, and then out here to the Ashley. So the creek bed itself and the areas closer to the creek bed obviously are at higher flood risk, but moving out into these to these lighter green zones, which is the high ground adjacent to Church Creek, is that high impact, high ground area. That means what happens here has a great impact all the way downstream the rest of Church Creek. And is especially important to consider stormwater and other water mitigation measures. So I'll pause here for Outer West Ashley if there are any questions. Flip back to existing development back and forth. All right, I will keep moving. Down to James Island. So overall, also very low in James Island Creek. You see it's sort of in the middle there with a high risk of wetland loss in this 3-foot scenario. Some areas of wetland are more vulnerable than others based on slight changes in elevation. This isn't to say that all of that orange area will be lost. There are other kinds of strategies that can be used to sustain wetlands and allow them to accrete with sea level rise, just identifying the risk. But more importantly, maybe for policy, is the marsh migration corridors. And there's a lot of things that can get in the way of these lighter blue marsh migration paths, whether they're seawalls and bulkheads, roads, other kinds of drainage infrastructure. Those areas also tend to indicate possible locations for stormwater sinks, so places that can absorb, places where water tends to collect and absorb. So there's a double benefit perhaps to considering reserving some of those or treating those areas in different ways. Elevation largely lower on James Island and surroundings. And then here we see the soil types more or less corresponding to the higher ground along the kind of Fort Johnson Road out in this area, and then in the Riverland Terrace area. And that basically corresponds to the high ground, low impact zones, those darker greens. So we'll zoom in twice here, once in the Riverland Terrace and then down by Grimble Road. So here's what's existing. Mostly infill development potential in this area. Folly Road is an important corridor to get down to Folly Beach, but also because it passes through this low point over James Island Creek. So there's a zone here in the middle, kind of where the expressway enters in, with high risk, increasingly high risk for tides coming up James Island Creek. But you see this Riverland Terrace Ridge and Riverland Terrace. Dark green again, because these are areas of low impact for their surroundings on high ground. So it's kind of the top of the watershed here of these smaller watersheds, relatively smaller watersheds. And then down Outer James Island, kind of Grimble Road area. See what's here now. Some kind of remaining pockets of heirs property and farmland, which down in this area corresponding to some adapt zone, but also some of this area that is otherwise potentially more suitable or has less risk on its surroundings and is relatively high and protected. So it's one of those areas where there's the trade-off is pretty stark between the cultural context here and the importance of the cultural landscape versus, versus the metrics we used, suitability for development. Any questions on James Island? All right. Moving to Johns Island. This is as zoomed in as we're going to get here. I think this is a little bit more of a familiar case. The ridge of higher ground along and parallel to the Maybank corridor and within the UGB. So you see that in brown here, this old sand ridge. Soil types. Marsh migration. Notice down here around Burden Creek, there's some projection to come up down around the executive airport. Relatively small watersheds, so relatively less impact for downstream communities and structures on Johns Island, sorry. So I think this analysis corroborates in many ways the Dutch dialogue study, but also some of the previous plans, Johns Island master planning and existing plans along the Maybank corridor. Any questions for Johns Island? And I'm happy to come back and answer any if they come up later. Okay, Cainhoy. This is perhaps a place where the balancing act is most critical and most stark. You see the highest ground basically in the city is located in Cainhoy, here in brown above 25 feet. This old sand barrier sand structure. Given its sand composition, its former dunes, former coastal dunes, it has high infiltration capacities, but that also lends it to suitability for this upland longleaf pine forest, thrives in sandy soils. And I'll show that forest here in just a second. On the lower surroundings around Cainhoy in this Johnfield Creek area, Newell Creek along the Wando. This is the area of Cainhoy Plantation, kind of in this whole area, overlapping the high and low ground. But you see the potential change that may be coming to this area in landscape function over the next decade and more, looking at the 3-foot sea level rise scenario. So I just want to be clear, this is not to take a position for development or no development in that area. It's just to point out the natural progression that the landscape may be expected to undergo as sea level rises and the marsh tends to migrate. And then the implications here. So you see lots of dark green, which may seem suitable for building in many ways. Also happens to correspond to historically significant Ayers properties, the longleaf pine forest, part of Francis Mary, and as you move farther out, Francis Mary National Forest. So looking at the points here on the left, Cainhoy has the largest swath of high ground in Charleston. However, it's ecologically and culturally sensitive. Much of this soil in this area has high infiltration capacity, so potentially benefiting, if used well, can benefit others downstream, other structures downstream. Large watersheds in this area would tend to compound flood risk, although there's little development there right now. And a significant marsh migration, which I raised. So zooming in, this is the Clements Ferry corridor just above Daniel Island, so kind of closer in. Here you see 526 kind of cutting across the bottom part of the image here. This is the existing condition and what the risk and impact overlay looks like, more or less corresponding to the high ground. And then moving a little farther out, here you see the bend in the Wando, Mount Pleasant on this side. and Clements Ferry. This is Clements Ferry running through the frame here. Part of Francis Marion National Forest is up off the top of the page here. And then what that looks like with the risk and impact. So generally corresponding again to the high ground along Clements Ferry. And here you see in the hatched green here, that marsh migration zone in the 3-foot sea level scenario. Okay, and that is the end. So happy to go back through any other questions or elaborate. There's a document that's literally hundreds of pages with the analysis for each of these focus areas across the city, which the city has, and I would encourage others to read closely. The rest of the process for us here looks like staying on call for a few more weeks to answer the questions from city planning staff as they come up and as they begin to look at the policy implications going forward.
Questions from the commission?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to jump in and say once again, thank you to this team for another detailed analysis that, you know, we're starting to get our glasses off and see our elephant for all of its different parts, water and land and housing and community. And so it's really good that each consultant took the baton and went deep with this so that we can make, you know, good policy, good recommendations, and good plan. And once again, I asked my question too soon because some of these maps do really show what I was looking for. So thank you for that.
Good, you're welcome. And I'll just
Randy. Andy, go ahead.
Just to echo everybody else in the kumbaya moment here. Really appreciate working with everyone at the city. It's an amazing group, unique for city, especially of this size. In our experience working elsewhere, very high capacity city structure. So it's been a pleasure to work with all of you and to receive your feedback over the last few months.
Well, I would just say that you know, another, as Ms. Jacobs alluded to, another prodigious set of presentation and a set of data that give us a whole lot to think about. And, you know, it makes me believe that, you know, this comp plan may have to evolve quickly because this is a whole lot to distill into a plan for any group in the short amount of time we have to do to produce a plan. So anyway, this is hats off to you for compiling all this. So thank you. Any other questions for our team from the Water Institute of the Gulf? Okay. Chloe, I believe now we have the citizen participation period.
There's an optional, there's optional additional content. There's a settlement community project updates that I have 2 slides worth if you want to hear it. If not, we can share it another time.
Yes.
And
Yes,
also
please
have
go.
a glimpse of the schedule for this year. You want to do that? Okay. Okay, surprise content. So as Donna mentioned earlier, she's been helping me with this work, and this is in direct response to what you all saw a lot in the feedback from the listening sessions about the cultural preservation work and recognizing these longtime communities that have deep roots in history, specifically settlement communities throughout the city of Charleston. And so, you know, post-Civil War, there were distinct patterns of land ownership and settlement throughout the city of Charleston by formerly enslaved African Americans, and somehow few of these, if any, well, there are. Maryville does have this plat, as you can see, when the town of Maryville was incorporated. But for a lot of the communities, they were never really documented, at least in map format. So their locations being identified with the extent of their boundaries and the names that they knew themselves as in any publicly available maps. And so Charleston County's done work on this in their historic resources survey, and we're building on that. The locations identified for City of Charleston are scarce. And so we have been meeting with community elders and historians and other folks who have been working on this research to build out this list and this map so that we can, just as a foundation to work on that cultural preservation long-term and incorporating that into our land use recommendations. So where we are right now is a working list and a working map. So I say working, bold, underline, exclamation mark, lots of emphasis. This is very much still a work in progress. It is evolving as we have more conversations. A lot of these names may be known differently depending on who you ask. So, and I have a meeting with Johns Island folks tomorrow. So that list that's not here yet will exist hopefully as soon as tomorrow. So, but as you can see, it's a good percentage of the city. It fits into this category of settlement community or something like it. So it's exciting. This is my favorite part of the plan that I get to work on right now, and I'm glad that we're doing it. So any questions about this before we wrap up this update?
One thing, Chloe, I'm noticing Turkey Pen isn't on James Island.
Right, I abbreviated. Turkey Pen, Ferguson Village are part of Downcut.
Got it, okay, okay.
I think I would just like to say, Chloe, thank you for working this, and that given what we heard from in our first presentation day we heard from the community, I think this is exactly what they would expect us to do, and so that I'm pleased that we're paying it this level of attention. So thank you.
And I'll also just note, you'll see here that I have Wando instead of, that's referring to the area of Canopy Peninsula. It's known to the community as Wando. So we use Canopy Peninsula more as a geographic reference, but the most appropriate cultural reference for that area of the city is Wando. So I'll be using that for this. Okay. So just a quick look at the schedule for this year. As you mentioned, Harry, this has got to come together quickly. So this month, the rest of this month will be focused on beginning to share the findings out with the public, drafting the plan. We'll continue that into February, wrapping up the draft plan polished, ready to present to Planning Commission at the February 22nd meeting. That will be for information only, so not a public hearing, no decision being requested. March is when we will, or following that meeting, going into March, we'll be kicking off our second round of engagement. So presenting the draft plan and gathering feedback. We'll have a short window of time to be able to incorporate that feedback, make revisions, and then come back to Planning Commission at March 24th meeting, and that will be for a public hearing. And then in April, we have a tentative date that's not confirmed yet, but we do hope to have a joint City Council Planning Commission workshop in early April. So it's a sprint.
Comments by the commission?
Does the engagement team feel comfortable with that time frame to re-engage for the draft? Because they're going to be really sprinting there. I don't know.
Yes, they are aware of the schedule and are planning accordingly. So we've worked. Yeah.
Okay, because that looks intense. Thank you.
I would just say that you said there's a tentative date for April that isn't confirmed. I hope that maybe, if possible, there's an effort to keep it out of the week that is Charleston County School District spring break, which I believe is April 5th through 9th, if I recall.
All right, thank you for bringing that up. It's in terms of city council meetings, they typically get scheduled. Christopher, you said what, like a week or two out is about as far out as we can expect.
The workshops, they get scheduled.
The workshops.
But yeah.
Right. So, but we will definitely keep that in mind.
Okay. All right, Chloe or Christopher, our public comment period.
Yes. Anna Catherine Carroll, I'm going to call on you first. So your microphone has been enabled.
Thank you, Chloe. This is Anna Catherine Carroll with the Preservation Society of Charleston. And first of all, just want to say thank you so much to all of the consultant team members as well as city staff for all of your incredible work throughout the update process across the board. Really informative data has been gathered thus far, and we recognize that public engagement has been a challenge during this time, so we just commend you all. And that being said, our principal concern from the beginning of this process has been the compressed timeline for completing this major plan rewrite, especially pertaining to community involvement. Since early spring, we've been calling on the city to request a deadline extension to allow the most thorough, engaged process possible. And as the originally projected deadline for completion was February of this year, we are asking for more clarification on how phase 2 will function. And we share Ms. Jacobs' concern for the engagement team's capacity to conduct follow-up with such a short turnaround this spring between Planning Commission and City Council meetings. So we also ask that an update be provided on the status of a deadline extension request to the state of South Carolina if there has been one. Given the critical importance of this plan, if any delay is to be formally pursued past the original completion date, we do feel strongly that the time necessary should be taken to get this right. So we thank everyone for their efforts so far, and we look forward to continuing to work together towards the best plan for Charleston. Thanks.
Okay, and now I'm going to call on Betsy LaForce. Your microphone has been enabled.
Thank you, Chloe. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks also to the entire city plan team for all the great work that's been put forth so far and for the educational opportunity today provided in this special Planning Commission meeting. Similar to the Preservation Society, we feel in the spirit of working towards increased communication and engagement between the city and the public, as was highlighted in the key takeaways shared by the community engagement team. We encourage city staff to announce publicly sooner rather than later the specifics around the process moving forward, such as how and when the public will be able to review and weigh in on the draft plan before it starts moving forward through the final approval processes of commission and council. And like Chairman Lassane noted in his comments, being able to respond to the draft and collect feedback will be critically important for the success of this process. We look forward to hearing more and remaining engaged throughout. Thank you so much.
Great. Chloe, do we have anybody else?
No, those are the only two you can signed up.
Thank you to the public for your comments. We'll take all those to heart. I think a lot of what the public had to say were echoed in the comments of the commission. So, to Chloe or Christopher, is there anything else that we need to bring before the commission tonight?
I think this is everything.
All right.
Not enough for you tonight?
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for your patience. This group is used to having to pay attention for a while, so not unusual, but to those of us who were able to be here, I really appreciate it. And I'll just echo what everybody else has said about the amazing work of the city staff and all of the consultants on all this. I don't want to belabor that, but I think I speak for all the commission when I say thank you for the amazing work you've all done. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I move to adjourn.
All in favor? I think we're done. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.